Welcome to episode 4 of the Studio Session podcast, where our mission is to support and inspire architecture professionals. I'm your host, Benjamin Varnell. Today, I am honored to be joined by Professor Brandon Rowe, a licensed architect, educator, and researcher with over 20 years of experience in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry. He's a member of the AIA, ICAA, and NCARB, and currently serves as an assistant professor of architecture at Utah Valley University, UVU. Brandon co-founded UVU's professional architecture degree and has been instrumental in developing nearly half of the core curriculum. He teaches architectural history and theory, 3D design software, and design studio. In addition to his academic role, Brandon runs his own firm called Tetrad Architecture and shares his expertise through his YouTube channel called Vitruvian Man Architecture, where he publishes tutorial videos on classical column orders and lectures drawn from his research. Professor Rowe was instrumental in my own success during my time at UVU, and I'm grateful to have a chance to sit down with him today. We'll be diving into 4 guiding principles that have shaped his architectural career and that I believe every architect should know. Welcome, Brandon.
Hey, thank you so much, Ben. Where do you go for curriculum when 95% of all architecture schools are based in a modern ideology? Can we have this balance between both and actually have a healthy dialogue? And design in and of itself is this iterative process.
UVU's architecture program is known for pushing students to the limits.
This is a good one. Is it hard? Yeah. Is it worth it? Yes. Can you define beauty? Is it truly in the eye of the beholder only? Is it subjective? So how can we design buildings to be 100-year buildings, to be multi-generational buildings? There's always buildings that leave a lasting impression on us. Those experiences go beyond ordinary to extraordinary. I think one experience that completely took my breath away was walking into the Pantheon.
What is something you're currently working on?
That's a great question. What am I not working on, right? Actually, this past Saturday, I presented a research project for the Beit Lehi archaeological dig in Israel at a conference here locally. It was on the Jesus is Here cave and some of the new interpretations that we're finding, particularly with that project. And then beyond that, this past fall, I presented at another conference in Spain, a project where a computer scientist and myself created AI-generated facades, classical facades and modern facades, and tracked those with visual attention and also measured their fractal dimensions and some of those kind of things. So been pretty busy, here and there. Lots of fun things new in the works all the time.
Very interesting. I know you're always working on something really important, and I'm really grateful for all your work in the field. So what are the current statistics at UVU? How many students are interested in the program now, and accreditation? How's that going?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you may recall we started with 20 students. And then the first 2 years, there was tremendous interest and growth. David and I, pretty much by ourselves. And it got up to like 200 students. So it's like, okay, David, you take 100, I'll take 100, right? And, but luckily we were able to hire some great additions to our faculty. We've got about 250 plus or minus students. Just in terms of how it works in the program, we've got 150 plus or minus students in the first year taking ARC 1010, our classical workshop. Then we have an application process, as you know, that allows students to get into that second year, and we accept 60 students. From there, they apply again to get into the 3rd through 5th year, and we accept 20. So between all those 5 years, we've got roughly about 250 plus or minus students.
That's incredible. And how is accreditation going?
Accreditation is going well. We had our last visit in 2023. and that was what's called a continuing candidacy visit. We just submitted our paperwork for the last and final accreditation
Wow.
visit, which is the initial accreditation. So we submitted that paperwork, and we will find out. Well, actually, we'll have a accreditation visit this coming fall, in October, and then we'll find out officially spring of next year.
Congratulations. That's great news.
Yeah, no, it's really good news. A lot of hard work. All of our students have been
Yes.
doing fantastic work, and our faculty have been hard trying to get all this prepared.
Certainly. I'm grateful for all the sacrifices you've made to make that happen.
Of course, but I'm not alone.
Oh, you're not. Yeah.
There is
Certainly.
one. Yeah.
Actually, in my interview with David Barker, he mentioned the significant sacrifices you made to help build UVU's architecture program, including writing half of the core curriculum in a record amount of time. And it kind of drove you to, well, obviously sleep a lot less and maybe even a neck injury. And anyways, your vision for the program has helped develop its unique design process. And I'd love for you to tell your kind of version of the story of how you formed the program with David Barker.
Yeah. Well, David, I love that guy. I was hired on in fall of 2019 and hired specifically to help start the program and help develop it. So we had our first cohort of students start in that fall when I started. And from the get-go, I had to create an architecture history class, right, from scratch, and we didn't have anything. And then the class after class, I kept developing new curriculum. Ultimately, 10 plus classes, 16 other classes I made major modifications to. So in and of itself, now 6 years later, I've taught 32, 34 classes
Incredible.
at UVU, but 10 of those were brand new from scratch. And so I guess the big question was, where do you go for curriculum when 95% of all architecture schools are based in a modern ideology or a modern approach to design? And so it required a lot of hard work and digging. We looked at Notre Dame's curriculum. We looked at Benedictine and others to get ideas and insights to see what worked, what didn't work. But I think also part of it was my own training as a modern, right, architect and how that influenced it. I wouldn't say it was all bad and it wasn't all good either. So what could we do that would be different? Our program was also unique in the sense that we embrace technology, right? And we teach drafting skills and other things that, emerging from a 2-year associate's drafting focused degree, how could we build on that? With not neglecting the importance of hand drawings and watercolors and other things. So yeah, it was a lot of hard work getting all that through. David and others have developed equally a lot of curriculum through the program in and of itself. But I know Dr. Milioti often refers to me as, "Oh, Professor Rowe, he was the founding father of this class," I think that's funny, but yeah, I guess you could view me as one of the founding fathers of one of the classes and curriculum, things like that.
I kind of agree with that.
Yeah. So I guess my fingers were on a lot of it, for better or worse. Yeah. But that doesn't mean things won't change and evolve over time and get better, because we want continual improvement and things like that too.
Right. Do you have any advice for other schools that might end up doing the same thing as you later on the road?
Yeah. I spoke at a conference in Norway last summer, and I discovered a new program, and they are starting to teach classical architecture, but it is a modern school. And it was interesting because it was an uprising of the students.
Oh, really?
The students found out that one of their professors had actually taught at Notre Dame and had a strong background in classical. And they said, please, please, teach us this. And so it's interesting to see some of their growing pains. Granted, they're in a modern school already. We built this kind of from the ground up. So it was a little easier in that sense that we didn't have maybe as much baggage, or we didn't butt heads as much
Ah,
with ideologies and things like that. So there are a number of schools that are trying to create classical curriculum. My alma mater at Catholic University in DC started a classical program, well, an emphasis or concentration in that, but yet they're still a modern school. And the dean, Mark Ferguson, they are embracing both philosophies. Can we have this balance between both and actually have a healthy dialogue between?
yeah.
And I think that's really important because we don't want to just be an echo chamber. Oh, we're all the
Yeah.
physicists
Right.
and good job. But we also want to have that conversation, if you know what I mean.
So, what's unique about the design process at UVU versus, say, when you went to school or at other schools?
So the design process,
Mhm.
I think one thing that we do at UVU that we picked up from the ICAA, from the École des Beaux-Arts, and from Notre Dame is the concept of the esquisse, right? And the esquisse being a quick sketch, come up with some design ideas. Whereas in a modern school, yes, there was that, come up with design concepts and partie and other things like that. But it was different in the sense that, hey, come up with, 10 iterations and then come up with 10 more iterations and then come up with 10 more iterations. And design in of itself is this iterative process.
Mhm.
But I think one of the things that we try to do is help you narrow down the design really quickly. And part
Yeah.
of that comes from my own experience in practice, where you don't have a lot of time usually.
Right.
And so sometimes those initial sketch and with the Ecole, their focus of, hey, choosing it, some esquisse concept sketches, choose one and you're stuck with that. You're married to that design idea and carry it all the way through. And if you
Right.
didn't, right, you would potentially fail the course. Um, so they were even more serious than we are. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that in and of itself can also prepare students to learn this quick design process that allows them to kind of move through that and also come up with design ideas that they can share with their clients.
UVU's architecture program is known for pushing students to the limits. How do you see the rigor of the program helping students develop resilience and a strong work ethic that prepares them for the profession?
This is a good one. Um, I hope it doesn't feel too much like we push students to the limit. The profession is very demanding. As you know, there's real world deadlines and you have to meet certain deliverables based on your client's requirements and other things like that. Um, One of the things that we tried to incorporate early on, and I think I did it with your cohort as well as the cohort before you, and I continue to do it. And that is, I require students, at least in the third year, to keep a timesheet,
Right.
right? To actually track to see how many hours they're working
Wow.
on a design studio, because based on university policy and other things, right, we have this set requirement of how many hours outside of class you should be working per hours and those kind of things. So, that ranges between 22 and I think 27 hours for design studio. Plus, the 10 hours that you're in a class, and that's a significant amount of time. That's basically a full-time job. And so some of our students that decide to work while they're going to school, as you know, can be challenging because
Right.
of what is expected with those requirements. But we're not trying to purposefully make students cry or create bone crushing work. I joked when I was in school that this is torture. This is quite the opposite of a pleasurable experience. And so, at some schools specifically, they work really hard to beat you down, to kill your self-esteem, to make you cry, to work you to death, basically. And we don't believe that, right? I don't believe in torturing my students as I was tortured, right?
Right.
But architecture does require a lot of hard work. Is it hard? Yeah. Is it worth it? Yes. But I think one of the main things that's important is, you touched upon this, is what does it do for the student? In the long run, it helps the student be more resilient.
Mhm.
It prepares them for the real world and the deadlines that they're going to face with their clients. Some of the things we did not maybe simulate in a real world as much is when a client comes at the 9th hour and says, wait a minute, hold on. I want you to change this, and kind of throws a bomb at you, right? And you have to then scurry back and regroup and try to think about how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to make these adjustments, these requests? Is this reasonable or is this not? And I think part of that is also learning how to communicate professionally. When students come to me and tell me, like, hey, we've got XYZ deadlines in our other class. Can we coordinate this better so they don't all line up at the same time? Sure, let's do that. Or, having flexibility to move a deadline if we need to. And I think one thing that I hope students get out of that is also that they should be open and communicate clearly with their clients as well. Yes, it's important to meet all of your clients' requests, but it's also important to have a sense of reality and say, hey, client, this request is actually a little bit beyond, or it's too much, right? Can we move it back, a couple days, or can we be more accommodating? Because when I was in a larger firm and I had a team that I was managing, a client would come with such a request at the 9th hour. Sometimes we'd say, okay, yes, can we bend over backwards and make it work? Yeah, we can. But sometimes we would go back to the client and say, we worked our hardest. We've been working late nights and doing all this. Unfortunately, we're not going to make the deadline. Can we have a couple more days? Right. And to just
Mhm.
have that conversation, because, we're all human and we're not perfect. And I think it's important for us to have sometimes those hard, honest conversations with whether it's our clients or our teams or others. And architecture school can be very hard and can be viewed as architorture sometimes. But it does definitely make you more resilient for the real world and some of those expectations and scenarios that you're going to encounter.
Yeah. So it's important for an architect to be able to learn those negotiation skills as well. The communication uh, that can happen can be negative if you're not prepared
Yeah.
for that conversation. Is there anything you'd recommend for a student to practice as you go into applying for the program?
Yes. Draw, draw, draw. The more you draw, the better you'll get at it. It's like any art or any musical instrument, right? The more you practice an art, They often say that to become a master at something, you have to put in 10,000, hours, right? And so I think one thing that can greatly help students is, yes, draw buildings, draw architecture, draw what you observe, but also just take a piece of trace paper and start tracing floor plans, tracing buildings, tracing those elevations, because that process of the hand, eye, mind connections that are being made, not only are you creating a physical drawing on the piece of paper or the trace paper, but you're also creating an image of that drawing in your mind. You're also creating a muscular image in your hands. So the more that you draw those buildings, the more they'll be second nature to you, and they'll be embedded or embodied within you as architects. And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of sketching, of drawing. Yes, watercolor and all of those other techniques are important, but the more you draw, the more you'll understand buildings and the importance of different connections, the detailing, all of those things.
Absolutely. When I got interested in attending the UVU architecture program, I attended ICAA lectures by yourself, Paul Monson, and Spencer Dennison, and they taught how to proportion Doric, Tuscan, Ionic, and Corinthian columns. And that kind of reinstilled in me the desire to draw, because when I was going into architecture, I was learning AutoCAD and learning Revit and thinking about how I can get a job. And I was really focused on the software side, and I was leaving behind drawing really fast. And those lectures grounded me in skills that I still use today before I ever jumped into Revit or AutoCAD. And it's an essential part of my process at work. I strongly believe that any student wanting to go into the UVU program should attend those lectures, because they happen every year, and it can kind of prepare you in a way for a lot of the work that you do at UVU.
Yeah. And, one other thing that's really critical, I think, in order to learn from buildings, besides just drawing them, is measuring them.
Right.
Going out and creating these measured drawings, because you can learn so much from measuring all those profiles and drawing them to scale, 1-to-1 or a smaller scale. And that's one of the best ways to learn all of these moldings and how they work together. Because those moldings, as you know, that's like the alphabet. And we're now putting them together and creating words. And then beyond those words, now we're putting a whole order together. Now we've got a sentence. And but ultimately, we want to create poetry with all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a new language, and there's a lot of new words to go along with it. And it's somewhat overwhelming at first, but then I think people catch on to the understanding that this is something that creates something beautiful, and there's a process. But when I was starting out, I felt somewhat restricted. This specific proportion creates it in this way. Of course, I learned by observing other buildings that did them completely different, but were still beautiful. This is not a restrictive process, but something that enables me to create something beautiful and create, like what you said, poetry, and something that other people can understand, even though they're not practiced in architecture.
Exactly.
So the main topic of this podcast is the 4 design principles that you have used to guide your professional career, as well as the creation of UVU's program. And they are: design with beauty, defend the authentic, build for time, and inspire the spirit. I remember you saying those 4 things at the end of each one of our design reviews, and it made me contemplate how much more I have to learn about architecture and why keeping what is more of like a philosophy instead of a design, it's something that guides you to and protects your design ideas from being scrutinized, and what ultimately makes beautiful architecture that stands the test of time.
The way that I came up with these guiding principles is I listened to a TEDx talk. Can't remember who it was now, but the individual said, you need to know your why. Why do you do what you do? What is it that drives you to become an architect? What is it that is causing you to want to create a better environment for others? Once you understand the why, that is your purpose. And so, I did a lot of soul searching over the years. And ultimately, I kind of landed on those. And actually, those are my core principles for a number of years before coming to UVU. And when I was working with David on trying to create the mission of our program and the core values that could guide our program, they're rephrased a little bit differently, right? But ultimately, designing with beauty and like you said, but we'll go through those. But starting with the first, beauty in architecture, how do I define that? Well, I could go back to Plato and Aristotle and who ultimately, Alberti borrowed some of those, but this relationship between the whole and the parts, that nothing could be added to or taken away. Now, that's kind of a simplistic version because then you're like, oh, okay, when is that? Right? Well, I know it when I see it, right? That was one of what I got in kind of modern school. It was kind of like, you will know it is good design once you see it, right? And you got to
Right.
tune your eyes. Well, yes, you can. And it takes time and a career to do that. But I think one of the things that modern science and other things are starting to reveal to us is that there is this pattern called a fractal. And as you know, you've had some of my classes, we talk about fractal patterns, and it's basically a pattern that repeats itself on a small micro scale, continues getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And traditional or classical architecture does that, where you
Right.
have these little moldings, these alphabet pieces, you compose them in words, they all relate to each other, you put them in order, those proportional relationships are still there. And that's what a fractal is. And we find fractals in nature, the universe, our human body, the like. And so scientifically, can you define beauty? Is it truly in the eye of the beholder only? Is it subjective? Modern science and neuroscience is starting to tell us no, it's actually objective. You can measure it. It's in the brain of the beholder more than anything. And so I would say, yeah, designing with beauty in mind, this relationship between the whole and the parts is so vital for good architecture design, right? It's one of the Vitruvian triads.
Can you share an example where a beauty elevated a project beyond mere functionality in your career?
Yeah, I had the privilege of working on several different religious projects, and those projects would not have been what they were had it not been for some of the ornamental detailing that made them fit into the cultural context, the place, the spirit of the place. And so we were, this was a neoclassical building, and we were trying to make sure we were getting all of the orders and proportions correctly. But we were also at the same time trying to communicate messages subtly, if you will, because our client definitely didn't want us to to intentionally put symbolism or, certain things like that on, but could we reinforce the building's purpose through, like you said, going beyond mere functionality to reflect the interior function on the outside through the massing, through the push and pull of the facade, through the grouping of the windows, the window fenestration pattern, um, all those kind of things, as well as, the ornamental detailing and things like that. So I would say those projects were able to transcend utilitarian, their function, although they did have a higher purpose than most buildings, being a sacred building. But I would say that, yeah, there's some good examples of maybe buildings that I've been able to work on.
I think that what you're saying resonates with me when I'm in a sacred space, be it of my faith or other people's faith. I resonate with the symbolism because it isn't just something that only means something to people that understand it, but good ornament can reflect on anyone, and they can maybe reflect back uh, with their understanding or interpretation of it, which can maybe inspire them um, and feel something transcendent or spiritual or sacred.
Hmm.
And, in other buildings that aren't necessarily religious buildings, to inspire them to learn and to grow as well as to contemplate.
Yeah. I think one thing that's important is that, like you're saying, buildings are not mute texts, right? They are textbooks.
Yeah.
Like in Victor Hugo's book, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This will kill that, meaning the printed book will kill the building, right? And how we read the building. And I think it's important for architects in general, young designers, to understand that, yes, you can have your design intentions. Oh, I want A to mean A. Well, someone will come along and say, oh, look at A, and that means B to me, right? So there's the multiplicity of messages that can come from our designs. And especially when we try to design with beauty in mind, that certain, like you said, someone from a different faith tradition may come in this and experience a whole nother thing. And I think it's important for architects to think of the insider experience, those that may be within a tradition or even your client, but also think of the outsider experience, the non-indigenous versus the indigenous. And I think that that's part of designing with beauty too, is considering that these design motifs or symbols are multivocal, meaning that they have multiple meanings, and also can be layered meanings as well.
The next principle that you want to talk about today is defend with authentic. What does it mean to defend the authentic in architecture, and how do you teach students to prioritize authenticity?
This comes from my mentor, Juhani Pallasmaa, who said that the ethical task of architecture and all art is to defend the authenticity of human experience. So, what does he mean by that? And why did I embrace that as one of my core principles, defending the authentic? I think one of the ways that students can come to understand that is we do not design in a vacuum. We do not design without the context in mind. We try to be sensitive of the history, of the memory, of the traditions that were there. Any respectful architect would want to design sensitively, right? To have whatever design intervention they are doing be respectful in that way. So when we say defend the authentic, part of that is, what is that authentic human experience that was in that place, the culture, and but then also thinking about, can you design something that's fake? Because we see a lot of classical architecture gets a bad name because sometimes it is designed without an understanding of proportions. And, oh, yeah, we're just going to slap some classical columns on this and call it good. And it looks really bad, right?
Hmm.
Is that authentic? No, probably not. The other argument is that, well, if you do anything from the past, and this comes from my training in a modern school, is that you are forbidden to copy or imitate anything from the historical past. However, it happens all the time. Like modern architects copy modern architects, and so really they're just doing precedent design. So I think to be authentic, traditional architects get accused of, well, you're just doing kitsch or you're doing Disneyland type stuff that's fake or fictitious. It's a false sense of history. But is that really being fake? Does it mean that we don't live in Greco-Roman times, so we can never design Greco-Roman building? Well, why did the founding fathers and early colonial architecture use that to speak of the Roman Republic and Greek democracy and some of those ideals? And can we borrow from other cultures and innovate and build on our own and create something new? Definitely. We definitely can. You see that in early Christian architecture, where they took this basilical form, which was a civic building, and adapted it for their sacred religious purposes, right? And then reinterpreted it. So why can't we still do that? And I think some of the greatest architecture of all time is because it has this echo. Some of my other colleagues call it this golden thread that's woven through the tapestry of time. There's this echo of archetypes, forms, symbols that are used, adapted, reused. They speak across time, and they also gain greater meaning and speak of humanity and existential foothold in time. Culture is so important. That's why one of my core values is defend the authentic in what we've tried to teach at UVU.
Can you share a time when you had to stand firm by defending the authenticity of a project in your either work or in teaching?
Yes, I've got a great example. So I was working on a religious project, and it was a renovation project. Having studied religious architecture, I knew the importance of small little moves, right, that could symbolize something or communicate a message. And when we were working on, it was a Latter-day Saint temple project, and the temple itself was elevated, 4 inches above was, the sacred room, the celestial room, which represents heaven. Another 4 inches below was the place of baptisms. And so the general contractor, and for a period of time, even my client was saying, well, it would be easier to just level off that slab and get rid of this little slight 4-inch elevation change, and it would just simplify construction, right?
Hmm.
And that was, I would say, that's just letting utility or functionality run the show, or have that part of the tail wag the dog, right?
Hmm.
However, if we did that, would that have destroyed the original design intent? I think it would have, right? There's this, some of the historic pioneer temples, they have all of these odd levels that change, and we've got stairs that go between them because it's trying to symbolize progression, this ascent, right? And so here we did it on a budget, these small little temples, but yet we could elevate it 4 inches here, decrease it 4 inches there. And that in and of itself, that is such a subtle change, but it's a bodily kinesthetic change that some people may not notice, but our bodies do. And at some point, we'll come to that realization, oh, why does this descend here? Why am I ascending to go into this next space? And there was design intent. So I would say that was one example of where I really had to kind of stick my ground and say, yes, I understand this could be easier, but is it maintaining the authentic message that was originally designed to be conveyed? Probably not. And so let's make sure we preserve that.
That happens every day. Architects around the world have to defend their designs, and they're not new to that idea, but they do need to contemplate what it's worth doing and balance with what the client's asking.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be a really difficult conversation. And coming to it with a background in understanding the worth of the authentic part of the project and being able to argue that is a skill that is necessary for that conversation to happen.
Mm-hmm. And that's another
Yeah.
skill you learn in architecture school, right?
Right.
To defend your position, and
Hmm.
not just to say to defend it to just because you're always right. And I
Right.
do not have all the answers, but there are times and places when it's appropriate.
The next principle is build for time. What does it mean to build not just for durability, but for lasting relevance? How does architecture remain meaningful over time?
I think the first thing is that we are in an environmental crisis, right? There's a big emphasis on sustainability to reduce our environmental impact, to be wise stewards of the resources we've been given. And I think building for time is part of that. If we design buildings with untested materials or cheap plastics or other things that are really going to last 20 years, 15 years, why? Is that really a why? Yes, there is the financial aspect that is driving most projects, but is that the best thing to do, to design a 15 to 20-year building? And then we tear it down, and then it goes into the landfill. Is that environmentally responsible? Probably not. So how can we design buildings to be 100-year buildings, to be multi-generational buildings, buildings like the cathedrals that took 100 years to build over several generations, but have now lasted thousands of years. And so I think there's an importance of understanding that sustainability is beyond just counting our CO2 emissions and other things like that, but it's also thinking about the longevity of materials, of designing buildings that can truly last the test of time. And I think your second question is, how can architecture remain meaningful over time? If we design something that is beautiful, if we design something that is authentic, and we design it so it lasts, then the next generation will find it beautiful as well. And maybe they're not going to use the building as a theater anymore or as a school, but they will find a purpose for it. And so if we design buildings that can be adapted, but we've also got an array of historic buildings that we can adaptively reuse, and that is a huge reduction to our environmental impact by doing that.
There is a lot of amazing examples of architecture that has lasted the test of time. And I think that it stands to reason that the buildings that we go back to learn from are the buildings that are standing the test of time and are meaningful because we use them as a resource to inspire us and to guide our design process. And the precedent process of understanding a building and its parts and how it's proportioned and its authenticity within its own community doesn't just, what does the building look like? Um, it's how the people react to the building, and how they strive to preserve the building, or even protest against its destruction in some cases, as
Mhm.
well as to reuse the building. And there are times when there's are buildings that have been adapted and maybe a negative way, and there's a negative reaction. That's also a clear sign of how meaningful it is to a community. I can think of a few buildings like that.
Waltz, no, definitely.
What have you learned from navigating tensions between creating timeless architecture and the realities of a budget and a client's demands?
I think the hard thing sometimes is that clients, they are concerned about the upfront costs with a project and they want to keep it as cheap as possible. But depending on who the client is, let's just say it's more of a commercial project or an institutional project or something along those lines. It's important, I think, to teach them that their project is going to make a larger cultural impact and has the potential for either being a good neighbor or being an eyesore of demonstrating their sensitivity to being a good environmental steward, of thinking for the long term, and how can this building give back and what does that mean, right, on the community. um, let's just say I have a bank that I'm going to design in a new community, right? If I just put up the cheapest materials on that and I know they're not going to last, and the client says, yeah, that's exactly what I want, then it starts, falling apart in a decade or more. What does that say about that client as a bank, an institution, right? That, oh, maybe I don't want to put my money in this institution. It's not permanent. Those kind of things. So I think part of it is getting beyond the trends of, hey, there's this flashy new material, or I want to appeal to a certain demographic. I think it's important to also think about the long-term image that's being conveyed um, when it comes to those budget realities, right? And with what a client's demanding, and just carefully navigate those waters with your client, and talk through some of those possibilities and what does this mean. And actually, if we design something to last longer, that actually could be more beneficial to you as a client, your return on investment. Yes, there's a little more upfront cost, but actually, hey, it might reduce your energy consumption
Mhm.
because of the thick thermal mass of your walls, right? So I think it's important for architects to understand that they can have this conversation with their clients.
The next topic is inspire the spirit. How do you approach designing spaces that inspire and uplift those who experience them?
Mm. I think by applying some of the principles we've talked about, designing with beauty, defending the authentic, building for time, ultimately all of that can help inspire the spirit. And what do I mean by inspire the spirit, or the inspire the human spirit? There's always buildings that leave a lasting impression on us. Those experiences go beyond ordinary to extraordinary. Some of my research with Dr. Julio Bermudez and his survey database has tried to understand the importance of some of these extraordinary experiences, these experiences that have left a lasting impression on people, that has changed their life, similar to a major life event like getting married or the birth of a child, like you just experienced, right? So what is it that can a building actually do that? Yes, it can. And I think by aiming at that goal to ultimately inspire others to create these experiences that are memorable, that's the most noble thing that an architect can do. And it goes beyond just the architect's pledge of, hey, I will, protect the public's health, safety, and welfare, right? And well being. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond just those basic fundamentals and ultimately to create a space that can touch our souls, can uplift us, can to use kind of a religious expression. There are a number of transformations that can take place when someone encounters a building in such a circumstance that can change their understanding of themselves in the world, kind of their metaphysical understanding of the world. It can change their pedagogical understanding from an educational standpoint. It can teach them something. It could change their spiritual or religious understanding of the world, um, their psychological state of being. So there's a lot of things packed into that inspire the spirit, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't say there's like one cut and dry formula. Yes, do X, Y, Z, and you will get this, right? But that is our goal. I think that architects should aim towards.
At UVU, in our class, when we designed the sacred architecture project, we used a matrix to analyze our project using thumbnail sketches of how a space, either in plan, section, or elevation, leads to us understanding what sacred significance it has to the project. And I was curious how you came up with that project assignment, and um, how can we improve on this process of analyzing the sacred?
When it comes particularly to sacred space, one of the guides that I've found most helpful is by Lindsay Jones in his book, The Hermeneutics of Sacred Architecture. Hermeneutics, a fancy word for how do you interpret sacred architecture or sacred space, right? How do you interpret the experience of it? And he's got a series of categories that he walks you through. One of the things that I've found that can be helpful is selecting a few of those categories, such as theater, contemplation, or sanctuary, and analyzing them from the macro scale of broader urban context, getting down to the building as we approach it, to moving to the interior, and ultimately getting down to the specific details, right, of a building. And that's what makes a good architect and what makes a good inspiring project is that attention to detail from the macro to the micro scale of design. And so when it comes to analyzing religious projects with that framework, I had researched a number of scholars and their frameworks, their theories, and that was one of the ones that I found most useful, most comprehensive. And, Lindsay Jones was no small person. He was mentored by Mircea Eliade, one of the premier historians of religion. He was the editor of the encyclopedias of religion. So he had studied lots of religions from a cross-cultural comparative standpoint. And so these patterns can be found in many different traditions. And so the matrix that I've introduced to students at UVU actually comes from my own master's research at Catholic University. And my master's looks specifically at several buildings, the Pantheon, Chartres Cathedral, and the Chapel of Ronchamp, all Catholic now, at least. And what is the experience of those for a contemporary person and mapping those design strategies? Because I really wanted to map the objective built conditions to people's subjective experience. Because if we can link them, then that's great, because an architect could design, hey, here's a dome, and this is what it's going to do to people. So you could actually design for experience. I think that's the important thing is, and as we think about inspiring the spirit, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is we're trying to design an experience for people, especially in a sacred space in particular. So students study buildings, as you know, Ben, with that matrix, and then they analyze their own design, try to put on this fresh new cap. And if I went to my own building for the first time, how would someone experience it? And so, yeah, going through that process is very helpful.
Extremely helpful. I still think about it today in my work. Can you share maybe an experience that you felt when you went into a building during this process?
I think one experience that completely took my breath away was walking into the Pantheon in Rome. Just the volume, the spherical nature of it, the dome completely encompassing me, silencing me, seeing the light penetrate that oculus at the top, that opening, and the light, that shaft of light hitting the side of the inner dome, and looking at that and actually seeing the shadow move. That was the most surreal thing, to see time in architecture, and not just time and the passage of the sun through space, but that time seemed to slow down physically. And I would say a lot of people that describe these spiritual experiences or these encounters with buildings, they often describe them as timeless or spaceless. And you know, the neuroscience actually is confirming that when we do have one of these, um, oh, what's the word? When we're initiated or allured at first into an experience and then projected into it, right? It's initiated, if you will. There's a part of the brain that is activated and another part that's deactivated. My mentor, Julio Bermudez, a lot of his research is on the contemplative neuroscience of architecture and how certain spaces can create a externally induced contemplative state, right? And so in those experiences, right, the front part of our brain, our cognition, our sense of self tends to deactivate. I think that's important to understand that when we experience a profound building, it has that possibility of doing that for us. Now, in terms of like sacred space, I think some people might start to get a little leery. Well, oh wow, you're gonna program God into people because of the architecture, and it's not that at all.
Yeah, it's not what we want to do.
No, it's how can the space reinforce, you know, the religious experience or the religious ideal you're trying to communicate. Um, I think that's important to kind of understand, is that the designers are these spatial choreographers. Then you have the religious leaders who are the ritual choreographers, and putting those things together allows you to have these ritual architectural events as people come and interact with those projects. And if you just have ritual or you just have building, right, it's not as powerful a transformative event.
That's a really good answer. So these are the 4 principles that you'd recommend for architects to guide their design process, as well as, as a way of analysis on maybe their previous projects to improve. And that's something that I'm really grateful for you talking about at school at UVU. And your insights today will probably be really useful for future students as well as professionals in the field. And I'm really grateful for you coming on this podcast. And I wish you luck in your future research, that in your future presentations that you have going on. We have a tradition on this podcast to share a question from the previous guest. And your question is, how do you plan on rocking the boat in architecture?
How do I plan on rocking the boat? Well, for one, I think I've rocked the boat a lot. With how our program is unique in and of itself. We've had a lot of opposition from other schools of architecture, from practitioners, from others, to the point where some people have been like, "Hey, you need to get rid of that guy," you know? So I definitely think we've rocked the boat in terms of the status quo in terms of architectural education. I think we'll continue to do that through ongoing research projects and other things that will, I think there's going to be a paradigm shift with modern architecture to address the ethical question of, if architects don't design with beauty, why? Why not? If we have scientific evidence that actually designing with certain patterns can actually enhance our visual attention or create a psychological, emotional, physiological response that reduces stress and is more healthy, right? Or defending an authentic cultural tradition or a unique memory of a place, we can't just ignore that anymore, right? We can't be ignorant of our context. And from a sustainability standpoint, building for time, designing things that can really last is a truly important thing. And then inspiring the human spirit. That is the goal we should all aim for. So I think many architects, if they maybe embrace those four ideals, if you will, that perhaps we can all rock the boat together and embrace the future.
Thank you, Brandon. Okay. So, what is your question for the next guest?
My question for the next guest, I think, AI in and of itself is going to change the discipline. 38% as of last year, Goldman Sachs predicted that AI was already influencing architecture and engineering and construction, and it's only going to increase. So, in what ways can AI, artificial intelligence, be embraced to accomplish the task of designing with beauty, defending the authentic, building for time, and inspiring the spirit?
That'll be a tough one. I look forward to that, asking that question. This has been the studio session. I'm your host, Benjamin Varnell, and I thank you, Brandon, for coming on this podcast and spending this time with us. And I hope that you catch us on the next podcast. And to all those students that are hoping to increase your skills and enjoy the journey through architecture school, if you want more content like this, please subscribe and like the channel. Please share this podcast with your fellow classmates as well as other friends that are interested in architecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. It's been an honor, truly been an honor.